Welcome to the Tough Decisions Network. This is our special Saturday edition called Step Up Your Game with Dan. I'm your host, Dan Hanford, and I'll be discussing topics to help you make better decisions to increase your productivity, increase your sales, and improve your overall marketing. Visit toughdecisions.net to sign up for our free weekly entrepreneur email. Before we get started, let's hear from one of our sponsors. Have you ever thought about investing in real estate, but find yourself so busy that you don't have time for it? Do you have FOMO, which is the fear of missing out? At HanfordCapital.com, we help investors with passive real estate investments that project better returns than traditional investment vehicles such as the stock market. If you'd like to find out more about our passive real estate investments, visit HanfordCapital.com. That's HANDFORD Capital.com. We will jump on a call with you to discuss your investment goals and to see if our investments are a good fit for you. This advertisement is not to be construed as an offer or recommendation to buy or sell a security. Visit HanfordCapital.com. On the podcast with us today is Scott Smith. He is back with us today, and he is going to be talking about the estate planning. And so he is the CEO of Royal Legal Solutions out of Austin, Texas, but works with folks all across the country. Welcome to the podcast, Scott.
Yeah, excellent to be here, Dan. We work exclusively with real estate investors all over the country, and come to find out that estate planning and also estate planning with how you combine that with your asset holding to protect your assets is really the number one thing that real estate investors have missed in their traditional training from gurus and seminars and all of that. So I'm excited to share with you today about what are the easy and hyper-effective solutions we can put together relatively quickly.
So walk us through what would be the best way to set that up, because I know a lot of people that listen to our podcast, are real estate investors, but they're also entrepreneurs and those kind of things in addition to just being a real estate investor. So what's the best way to structure that for the best protection?
Yeah, so it doesn't matter whether you're a real estate investor or just have assets, right? Real estate investing just happens to be the one type of asset class that has inherent liability because people get hurt on your property, right? But Anybody that has over $50,000 in wealth should be thinking asset protection at some level, at least, right? We know that rich people don't own things. They control companies that own things. But now we can do that ourselves at a very easy and affordable kind of way. But in terms of the estate plan that we want to put together, if you're a real estate investor especially, but really I would say for just about everybody, would be a living trust and a combination of what's known as a pour over will. And the reason you have to use a living trust is because if you use a living trust, you avoid the court proceeding that happens with your stuff when you die, right? And it becomes really important with real estate because if the assets get caught up in the court proceeding, you run into a situation where nobody has control of the assets. They can't make payments, they can't collect rents, they can't otherwise manage the insurance. And then all of a sudden you could find those assets that you thought you were going to pass, all of a sudden, are now exposed, right? They could get foreclosed on, get a fire on them because the insurance went late or whatever, right? If you use a living trust, on the other hand, there is no court proceeding that goes with that. It immediately gets passed to your heirs. So you avoid all of the headache of the proceeding for your heirs, as well as making sure that the assets are going to be safe and pass exactly how you intended.
So I've heard of living trust before, and I've heard of trusts. What's the difference between just a trust versus a living trust? And why would we go with a living trust versus just a standard trust? Or maybe I'm getting the terminology wrong. I don't know.
Yeah, well, there's actually only types of trusts that actually exist, right? They're called revocable trust and irrevocable trust. And most all the time that you're working inside of like what people consider trusts are all types of revocable trusts that attorneys just call different names because they have different purposes, right? So a living trust is a type of trust that says it's a living revocable trust that you structure all of your assets underneath during your life and then becomes irrevocable when you die. Right? So that would be the way that every type of estate planning trust is put together. It's always that same type of context because it has the best tax advantages for doing it that way.
What's really the main difference between just putting all of your assets in an LLC versus a quote unquote trust, if you will?
So if you put all of the assets inside of an LLC and only had that piece of it, what happens is that the LLC itself goes through your probate process, goes into the court system with all of that property in it, which has the same problems as if you had it in your personal name. LLCs should only be thought to protect the property itself from external lawsuits that happen. So in an ideal structure, what you'll do is this, is you'll have a living trust at the very top of your asset holding pyramid. Underneath your living trust, you would put together a series LLC, and that the living trust would own the series LLC. outright, right? And then the series LLC with all of its individual child series own all of the individual assets and your bank accounts and your stocks and everything else in your life that you would consider an asset that would have any value. Because then what will happen is that the living trust is dividing up the company itself. So that way all of the assets are protected during your life, and then they all avoid probate because now the living trust owns the company. And then the additional, plus factor to that is that your living trust essentially never becomes out of date, because all of the assets are going to go in and out at the company level throughout your life, because that's how you're going to be like buying and selling assets, always out of the company level. And the living trust just divides up the company. So now it can never go out of date, right? Which is very different than what people normally do with the living trust, is they'll say, hey, well, I want to have an estate plan and put a living trust together, and they don't have any company structure there. So what they've done is they said, well, we're going to have to title every piece of real estate, every bank account, everything that I have has to be titled inside the name of the living trust, which is fine. I mean, there's no protection there because the trusts themselves don't provide any protection. But overall, it would accomplish the goal of avoiding probate, except for the fact that nobody keeps these up to date correctly. And I mean, nobody. I've never once had a client come to me with a living trust and show me their assets and be like, oh, you guys have been maintaining this perfectly. It just doesn't happen. So the way that we set it up with the living trust owning a company structure, like a series LLC or a Delaware statutory trust, if you live in California, means that it never goes out of date. And it's always going to keep your assets ultimately at the highest level of protection throughout your life.
So you as the individual would own the living trust, and then the living trust would own the series LLC.
Correct. And then the series LLC would in turn own all of your assets.
Okay. And when you pass away and you're trying to take that and give it to your heirs, what does that process look like? That would be, like you said, not inside of, the legalities or the probate.
Yeah, it avoids probate. So it can't get caught up in this complicated legal proceeding, which I'm sure everybody's heard about, like people challenging wills and all of that stuff, right? That can happen over there. It avoids all of that. So what you end up getting is that you would own the trust owns the company structure. And anytime during your life, you can reorganize everything you want to. There's no tax consequences of setting this up now. Then whenever you die, what happens is now the living trust becomes irrevocable, right? Because you're dead. You can't revoke it anymore because you're dead. So it's irrevocable. And then the company itself is divided among all of your heirs, which you specified inside of the living trust document that I want, Carol to have 10% and Doctors Without Borders to have 20%, et cetera, right? So then all of the assets get split up that way. So in a way, you're also able to pass your assets to your heirs inside of a protected structure if you do it this way. So that way, not only do you get the benefits of all of the asset protection during your life, but your heirs do as well.
And so that you can structure it where instead of just being percentage, you can say this particular business or property can go to, Aunt Sue or whoever, that you wanted it to go to. It doesn't necessarily have to be percentage.
Yeah, 100%, right? The way that these structures are set out is that you should think of it as being infinitely flexible. There's really nothing you can't do legally, right? So if you can dream it, then with a good attorney, you can achieve it when it comes to how do you want things to go.
Does this also allow for any skirting around any of the estate taxes and death taxes and things like that? Or would that still be involved with this type of a living trust?
Yeah, so those are different strategies that are higher level when you start having to look around skirting, the estate taxes. So that's that 11 million per person, right? That's that right now. When you have to start looking at that route, you have to start looking at, tax saving plays with that. So there's a couple of different things you can do with that if you're above that level. Like one of them would be, it's called restrictions on alienation of shares of the corporation, right? And with that, what you would do is you would say, hey, well, my real value of my real estate's not $11 million. It's actually the value of the company that owns it. And the company itself is actually only worth half as much as you think because there's all these restrictions put in place for it, right? But that's really nuanced issues that you really have to talk with, really are case-by-case basis for what it is that each individual would need. But for what I'm recommending here today for everybody is really just like a basic setup that says you have a living trust that then owns your series LLC for your asset holding company, and that takes care of all of your assets during your life and takes care of avoiding probate and passes everything over nice and tidy over to your heirs where you avoid all the problems of things getting caught up in court. Then you have a completely separate document, which would be your will. It's called a pour over will. And it's a simple one-page will that just says anything that I didn't put inside of my living trust in my life, what I'd like you to do is pour it into the trust and then distribute it accordingly to however the trust says. So then you only have like one document called your living trust document that you ever would have to update if you ever want to make changes, like, so-and-so turned out to be, a disappointment to you because they married that person. And so you're going to write them out, or whatever, right? I don't really know, whatever the case can be. Like, for any reason you need to change it, like it's really simple to do it.
Mm-hmm. What are, from the estate planning side of things, since that's what our topic is today, what are some of the top questions that you get all the time about estate planning?
Yeah. So number one is, what should I do? Right. I think most people always think, oh, well, estate plan, I should get a will. And really, a will is good, because without a will or anything put in place at all, if you have nothing put in place, what happens is all of your assets get chosen where they go by the court. The court makes all those determinations for you. So I can imagine you, Dan, sitting here and all the listeners right now being like, probably pretty shocked. He says, like, what do you mean? The court actually gets to decide where everything goes if I don't have a will in place? And that's how it works. If you don't actually state your wishes out and then have a will recorded with it.
And we all know how well the government makes decisions.
Yeah, right. Well, they get to decide on whatever way they want it to go is the way that those get passed, right? And that can change from state to state. So you have to have it at the bare minimum. What you would want to have is something in place that has a will. So that way you can at least decide, if you care at all where your assets go when you die, you need at least a will put in place to be able to say, I want this to go to whoever, right? The next step up from that, or I would say in tandem, what you should do with that is, instead of focusing a ton on the will itself, just use a simple one-page will for that. Instead, focus your attention on the living trust aspect of what you're doing. Because even better than a will is a living trust. Because even if I had everything structured through a will, everything would still have to go through the probate process with the will, which means that it's subject to all of the challenges and all of by challenges, I mean like external people challenging it, saying, hey, that's not right, or he promised me something different, or whatever, right? That goes with that.
So why don't more and more people do the living trusts versus the wills?
Yeah, well, the people that know do, right?
It's just lack of information and lack of education.
100%, right? If there's one thing that I found out from being really on the stage here for the last 4 years, of talking to people about asset protection with real estate and entrepreneurs, and how entrepreneurs should start their companies, what should people be doing with their estate planning, what should we be doing with 401ks and IRAs and all of this stuff. 100% of why don't people do a better job at this is because there's just not good educators. And so that's what I've charged myself with, is to be the educator for people and coming and saying, like, here's obviously the right way for us to all to be doing it. So let's just take this as a minimum threshold, set these up. And then for each individual person, there's, for everybody that's, in the underneath $11 million in assets, what I believe is that the systems that we use for the estate planning with the living trust and the pour over wills, as well as the asset holding companies that we set up for people and the shell corporations that we use for people to transact business through, work for 99.9% of people with what the businesses they're doing. There's really a very small margin that it makes sense for things that have to be tweaked or customized, around that, right? But the problem is that, up to me taking on this type of work, I feel like what happened is that everything was like really fragmented. Like, you get a little bit of information about estate planning over here, a little bit of information about wills over here, a little bit about LLCs, a little bit about 401ks and tax planning. And that's what I've worked to try to culminate it together. But yeah, man, it really all comes down to just simple education, which is what I'm a big proponent of. Like, how can we get education cheaply out to people so that way they can get up to speed on?
So when you talk about these living trusts, if you are married, how does that work? Are you both owners of that trust, or is it just you have two individual trusts, or how does that work?
Yeah, I've seen it both ways, actually, right? So you can do like joint living trusts, you could do joint wills. The considerations that is saying that do you have different wishes for how you want your assets to be distributed, right? There's difference between states that consider all of the assets of a married couple to be one pool of assets, right? Then states that will say, well, really, we're keeping these, separate. The husband's assets are his, the wife's assets are theirs, right? So if you're happy with everybody playing by the same rules, and say it's one big pool of assets and we're both going to play by the same rules with where these assets are going to go whenever we die, then yeah, you could just do it joint.
Is that $11 million like threshold? Not really a threshold, but like you said, like under 11 million, 99% of the time, this is the best option for you. Is that on an individual basis, or is that on a joint basis as well?
Yeah, so it's 11 million per individual, and
Okay,
22.
so it'd be like 22 million if you were a joint.
Right, and most people have less than $22 million.
Yeah, and is it asset wise or is it net worth?
It's net worth.
Okay.
Yeah, you don't actually count all your debt as part of towards that.
Sure.
So.
Okay. So, okay. All right. That makes more sense.
So then you're able to do really cool stuff with this. Like once you're able to set up your living trust structures, you can set up your business operations simply underneath it. And by your business operations, what I'm really referring to is your asset holding companies, right? Because you would have your living trust that would then be at the top of your portfolio for all of your assets, for your stocks, your cash, all of your properties, whatever that's going to be for you, right? Your IP for your website, whatever that is, right? All gets protected inside of your asset holding company, which owns everything but doesn't manage everything through your whole life. And then what you would do is you would have these separate shell LLCs that act as your operating LLCs that don't necessarily have to be owned by your living trust as part of your estate plan because they don't own anything, but you would conduct all of your business through them to help you with like lawsuit prevention during your life. So the only reason I bring that up is to say that not everything out there necessarily has to be part of the living trust. We just want everything that's actually an asset in one way or another to be underneath the umbrella of the living trust, because those are the things that we want to make sure that they pass without, the being challenged, and that they pass immediately. So that way they don't get caught up in probate and you don't have problems with, insurance not getting paid or rents not being collected or otherwise, having, catastrophic problems with the assets.
So entrepreneurs that are listening right now that already have their other structures of their corporations and their LLCs in place, and they don't have this living trust in place, how hard or how complicated is it for that to be put into place when there's already an existing structure?
Incredibly easy. It really takes only about a week. That's what we find is about typical turn time to be able to put it in place. And then after it's put in place, it'll be done for forever if you have your other company structures put in place already.
And you do that for free?
Absolutely. Yeah. Unfortunately, we're not able to do that currently. But what we do is we typically looking at, you should typically think about estate planning to cost, for somebody that actually can integrate the pieces together. You're typically looking at somewhere between $2,000 and $4,000. I would say just on average, looking at the country, what would you get for that? And the reason that it costs that is because once you're starting to talk about like an estate plan that needs to actually integrate with the assets, integrate with the company structure that's in place and make sure there's not tax issues and other issues that can pop up with that, that's when you start having to pay attorneys, right? If you don't have anything at all really right now, but you just say, hey, I want an estate plan because I just really want to have a will that talks about like who gets to take care of my kids and those pieces, I'd say probably like LegalZoom is definitely a decent option for that because it'll just give you the basic forms of what you need to do. But once you start having any appreciable amount of assets or you have an appreciable amount of company structures that are operating, and there's actually some diligence that needs to be spent on making sure that this is going to be funneled up correctly, what I recommend everybody do is, even if you don't call us, even though we're capable of doing it all for you, is to call somebody that can really sit down with you to say, like, what's a plan that you can put together today and that will last you for forever. What you don't want is a plan that you put it together today that's cheap, that then you have to update every year because frankly, you just won't do it. I mean, we've just never seen anybody be successful with doing that unless, they were, say like a member of our firm, because we force everybody to do that by having at least one yearly review with us where we look over everybody's, the way they're doing their accounting, whether they're handling their payment structures, whether they're handling the companies, whether they're handling their estate plan, because we do a yearly review with all of our members to ensure that, all the I's are dotted and T's are crossed in their life. But I think we're one of the only few companies in the country that actually do that.
So do you need a living trust and a will?
Yes.
Or just one?
You need both because the living trust tells you where the assets go. Like that's where everything needs to be structured underneath that, right? Then remember what happens if you don't have a will in place at all, the government decides who gets what. Because remember, it wasn't part of the living trust, right? It's like outside of it. It's like your beat up Honda Civic that you never decided that you wanted to protect or put inside of the living trust structure. And so you'd say, okay, well, what happens with my Honda Civic or my watches or something, right? You don't have a will in place. The government actually decides what happens to those assets. So if you put a will in place and all of a sudden the one page pour of a will says, take all of those assets, pour it into the living trust and then distribute it accordingly.
Okay. And also in the will gives other types of, end of life directives and those kind of things that wouldn't necessarily be in the trust.
Yeah, so those wouldn't be in the trust. They might not even be in the will, right? So if you're looking at the other pieces of the estate planning that we put together for people, we also include 2 other types of documents, which include the healthcare power of attorney and a durable power of attorney. And those are the things you need in place because you didn't die, It's like Scott didn't die, so who's going to make medical decisions for him because he can't make them for himself? That's a healthcare power of attorney. And then the other one is Scott didn't die, so who's actually controlling all of these real estate and who's actually going to be able to be a signer for any of those pieces, right? And that's where your durable power of attorney kicks in. So there's really 4 pieces total, right? There's the 2 pieces that happens for the stuff when you die. That's your living trust, hold your assets, your pour over will that dumps everything into your living trust if you didn't put it in there. And the other 2 pieces are, I got really hurt and I'm not dead though. So the other 2 things that kick in whenever I'm dead don't work yet. So who's going to make my medical decisions for me because I can't? And who's going to handle my money for me because I can't. And those are also able to be, very limited, right? It's not like you necessarily have to give like blanket control to somebody to be able to do everything. You're able, in those power of attorneys, you can spell out like, here's what they're able to do or what I allow them to do. So you don't end up with, your buddy Tito handling all of your assets when you're, end up in the hospital and all of a sudden he's like, yeah, dude, well, I had to sell it and move to Cayman's, because you got hurt. So you got hurt, bud. And you're like, Tito, you bastard. Yeah.
Well, Scott, I could talk about this kind of stuff all day long. I love this topic. I really enjoy it. And I really appreciate you coming on the podcast and sharing some more of your knowledge with us. And, I know on some future, episodes, we'll dive into some more topics on asset protection. How can the listeners reach out to you if they want to, ask you a few more questions or jump on a call with you and see if there's something that they can, have you help them with from an asset protection standpoint?
Yeah, whether it's asset protection, land trust, estate planning, anything essentially, you need inside of the business realm for that, you can call me at 512-757-3994, or you can email me at scott@royallegalsolutions.com, or just contact us at the royallegalsolutions.com website. I'll be able to get in touch with you guys off from there. And if you just want some free information or whatever the case may be, we have tons and tons and tons of it on there. We also have a good promo link for you guys. We're going to be giving away some awesome freebies at the royallegalsolutions.com/tough-decisions-podcast.
And we'll make sure that in the show notes, we have those links so that our listeners, as they're driving down the road or working out and exercising or wherever they're listening to the podcast, will be able to go back to the show notes and get those links. Again, thank you so much, Scott, for coming on with us. Look forward to having you on a future episode.
Thanks, Dan. Great to be here.
All right. Bye.
Thank you for listening to the Tough Decisions Network. Be sure to visit toughdecisions.net to gain access to show notes for this episode and to join our free weekly entrepreneur email, where we will send you news about the latest technology for your business, inspiring quotes, and the latest books for entrepreneurs. That's toughdecisions.net.